The Mediterranean sky in early 1943 was a beautiful, lethal trap of endless blue. For an American pilot strapped into the cockpit of a P-40 Warhawk, the view was often the last thing he saw before his world dissolved into fire and jagged aluminum. Inside the cockpit, the atmosphere was a grueling assault on the senses. The overwhelming roar of the 1,200 horsepower Allison engine just 6 feet ahead, the suffocating scent of high-octane fuel mixed with the metallic tang of hydraulic fluid, and the blistering heat of the North African sun that turned the fuselage into a furnace. Allied pilots were being bled white at a rate that defied the industrial might of the United States. The clamped tactical doctrine of the time was a desperate script written in the blood of green aviators. Maintain altitude, keep your speed, and never, ever attempt to turn with the enemy. But the math was rigged. The German Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Italian Machis were faster, climbed higher, and were flown by battle-hardened veterans who had perfected the art of the vertical bounce. They hunted in pairs, diving from the sun at 400 miles per hour, delivering a surgical burst of cannon fire and vanishing back into the clouds before the P-40s could even bank their heavy wings. To fly a Warhawk against the Luftwaffe wasn't a duel, it was a struggle against a predator that held every aerodynamic advantage, leaving Allied squadrons cycling through young men like spent shell casings. As the losses mounted, a grim silence settled over the desert airfields. Ground crews scrubbed blood from leather seats, while pilots sat in the shade of wing roots sketching doomed flight paths in the sand and wondering which of them would be the next to vanish into the bruised gray of a burning wreck. The official reports from high command were a chorus of sympathetic but empty promises, urging pilots to stick to the manuals even as those manuals failed them daily. The P-40 was a pre-war design, rugged and tough, but in the thin air of high-altitude combat, it was a sledgehammer being used in a knife fight. Every veteran knew that once a German ace locked onto your tail, you were already a ghost. The only question was how long it would take for the fire to reach the fuel tanks. However, in the corner of a crowded briefing tent, one pilot, a quiet Texan named Lance Wade, wasn't looking at the casualty lists with despair. Instead, he was staring at his notebook, obsessed with a single heretical calculation. While the world believed the P-40 was a failure, Wade had discovered a dead zone in the flight envelope of the superior Messerschmitt. He realized that the very thing the manuals warned against, deliberately bleeding away all your speed, wasn't a death sentence, it was a doorway. In a shocking departure from every rule of survival, Wade was preparing to prove that the only way to kill the world's fastest predator was to stop flying and start falling. Lance Wade was not the quintessential poster boy for the Army Air Corps. In fact, the very institution designed to produce heroes had twice shown him the door. Growing up in the dust-choked plains of Belton, Texas, Wade didn't view flying as a romantic pursuit of glory, but as a complex problem of mechanical engineering. While other pilots spent their leave in the bars of Cairo or Casablanca, Wade could be found in the shade of a hangar covered in grease, debating the finer points of manifold pressure and wing loading with the ground crews. He approached his P-40 Warhawk not as a weapon of war, but as a high-performance machine with a strictly defined mathematical envelope. Rejected by the U.S. military for eyesight that didn't meet their rigid pre-war standards, he had crossed the Atlantic to join the Royal Air Force, bringing with him a machinist's mindset that favored data over instinct. He kept a meticulous private logbook that was less a diary and more a technical manual. In its pages, he didn't record the thrill of the hunt. He recorded the exact air temperature, the gallons of fuel consumed during a climb, and the precise moment the controls grew mushy at the edge of a stall. To Wade, the air was a three-dimensional grid of potential and kinetic energy,
and every maneuver was a transaction where speed was the currency. This obsession with the secret geometry of flight made him an enigma to his squadron mates. To the veteran RAF pilots who had survived the Battle of Britain, Wade's constant questioning of established doctrine seemed eccentric, if not dangerous. He spent hours alone in the sky during training sorties, deliberately pushing his aircraft into violent spins and low-speed stalls, just to see how much grip the P-40 had left when its airspeed plummeted. He discovered that while the Messerschmitt Bf-109 was a master of the vertical, its narrow wings and high wing loading made it unstable at the very speeds where the heavy, rugged P-40 could still hold a steady turn. Wade was essentially teaching himself to fight in the dead zone, the low-energy state that every instructor taught pilots to avoid at all costs. He was perfecting a way to weaponize the P-40's greatest weakness, its weight. By late 1942, his notebooks were filled with sketches of descending spirals and high-G brakes that looked like suicide on paper. But as the desert sun set over the airfield, Wade realized the ultimate irony. The American military had rejected him because he couldn't see a chart on the wall, yet he was the only pilot in the Mediterranean who could see the invisible lines of physics that would allow a second-rate fighter to slaughter the elite of the Luftwaffe.
By the spring of 1943, the air war over the Mediterranean had evolved into a clash of two opposing philosophies: the energy of the Luftwaffe versus the maneuver of the desperate Allied survivors. To the German aces, combat was a vertical game governed by the relentless laws of gravity. They utilized a tactic known as boom and zoom, where they remained high above the battlefield, converting their superior altitude into terrifying kinetic energy through a high-speed dive. The standard Allied doctrine, hammered into every pilot's head, was to maintain speed at all costs to counter this. The manuals warned that a slow aircraft was a dead aircraft because it lacked the energy to escape or climb. However, Lance Wade began to see a fatal flaw in this logic. He spent his nights in the dimly lit officers' mess, not drinking but sketching complex diagrams of turning radii and velocity vectors. He realized that while the Messerschmitt By the spring of 1943, the air war over the Mediterranean had evolved into a clash of two opposing philosophies: the energy of the Luftwaffe versus the maneuver of the desperate Allied survivors. To the German aces, combat was a vertical game governed by the relentless laws of gravity. They utilized a tactic known as boom and zoom, where they remained high above the battlefield, converting their superior altitude into terrifying kinetic energy through a high-speed dive. The standard Allied doctrine, hammered into every pilot's head, was to maintain speed at all costs to counter this. The manuals warned that a slow aircraft was a dead aircraft because it lacked the energy to escape or climb. However, Lance Wade began to see a fatal flaw in this logic. He spent his nights in the dimly lit officers' mess, not drinking but sketching complex diagrams of turning radii and velocity vectors. He realized that while the Messerschmitt B-109 was a king of energy, it was a slave to its own speed. At 400 miles per hour, the German fighter's controls became stiff and its turning circle expanded significantly. Wade's heretical theory was simple. If he could force the enemy to fight at low speeds, a state of energy bankruptcy, the P-40's rugged high-lift wings would suddenly grant it a surgical precision that the faster German could not match. The tension within the squadron grew as Wade began to openly challenge the veteran instructors. During one heated briefing, he stood before a blackboard covered in chalk arcs, explaining that the P-40's heavy Allison engine and low wing loading were actually assets in a flat grind. He argued that by deliberately bleeding away his speed, ignoring every survival instinct, he could tighten his turn so violently that a diving attacker would be forced to overshoot.
This was a radical departure from the energy management theory that dominated the era. While others saw a stall as a precursor to death, Wade saw it as a tactical reset button. He practiced this snap turn in the heat of the North African afternoon, pushing his Warhawk until the airframe groaned and the rivets seemed ready to pop. He found that if he timed a high G brake perfectly, he could make the P-40 bite into the air, pivoting the heavy nose toward the enemy's projected path before they could react. It was a high-stakes gamble with physics. He was essentially betting his life that he could maneuver in the dead zone, where the Luftwaffe's energy-based tactics became useless. He knew the cost of failure was a fiery plunge into the desert, but the math in his notebook told him he had found the only way to turn a second-rate fighter into a silent executioner.
The theoretical calculations in Lance Wade's notebook were finally put to the ultimate test in March 1943, high above the shimmering heat haze of the Mediterranean. Wade was flying a routine escort mission for a slow-moving transport run when the dreaded call, "Bandits high!" crackled through his headset. Two Messerschmitt Bf-109s, emerging from the blinding glare of the sun, initiated a classic vertical pincer. As his wingmen scattered according to standard doctrine, Wade found himself isolated, the primary target for a German ace who had already lined up a perfect deflection shot. To any other pilot, this was the end. The Messerschmitt was closing at a terrifying 400 miles per hour, its nose cannons flickering with lethal intent. Wade's training screamed at him to dive and run, to use his P-40's weight to build speed and pray for an escape. The theoretical calculations in Lance Wade's notebook were finally put to the ultimate test in March 1943, high above the shimmering heat haze of the Mediterranean. Wade was flying a routine escort mission for a slow-moving transport run when the dreaded call, "Bandits high!" crackled through his headset. Two Messerschmitt Bf-109s, emerging from the blinding glare of the sun, initiated a classic vertical pincer. As his wingmen scattered according to standard doctrine, Wade found himself isolated, the primary target for a German ace who had already lined up a perfect deflection shot. To any other pilot, this was the end. The Messerschmitt was closing at a terrifying 400 miles per hour, its nose cannons flickering with lethal intent. Wade's training screamed at him to dive and run, to use his P-40's weight to build speed and pray for an escape. Instead, with a calmness that bordered on the supernatural, he did the unthinkable. He didn't dive. He pulled back on the stick with agonizing violence. The P-40's nose pitched up toward the sky, its heavy Allison engine screaming as the aircraft fought the sudden, massive G-load. He was deliberately throwing his plane into a state of energy bankruptcy, trading every bit of his precious speed for a single, impossibly tight arc. The world inside the cockpit became a blur of gray and red as the G-forces slammed Wade into his seat, tunneling his vision and threatening to plunge him into unconsciousness. The P-40 shuddered violently on the very edge of a stall, a mushy vibration that usually signaled a death spin, but Wade held the turn with the precision of a surgeon. The German pilot, committed to his high-speed dive, watched in disbelief as the American fighter didn't flee, but pivoted like a gate on a hinge. Because the Messerschmitt was moving too fast, its own momentum became its enemy. It could not turn inside Wade's radius and overshot the target. In a sudden, jarring reversal of roles, the hunter flashed past the Harder's nose, completely exposed. Wade rolled out of his near stall, his nose now pointed directly at the German's tail. He had successfully inverted the geometry of the fight. The German ace, panicking at this violation of everything he knew about American tactics, broke away and fled back to altitude, unwilling to engage a man who fought like a ghost in the machine.
Wade had just performed the first Wade turn in combat, a maneuver that proved that on the edge of a stall, the P-40 wasn't a victim, it was the world's most dangerous pivot point.
The return to the dusty airfield was not met with the fanfare one might expect for a pilot who had just cheated death. Instead, Lance Wade walked into a briefing tent heavy with the weight of tradition and the stench of stale tobacco. When he filed his combat report describing the violent, low-speed reversal that saved his life, the reaction from his squadron leader was one of sharp, cold skepticism. To the by-the-book commanders, Wade's maneuver was reckless aberration, a suicidal fluke that violated every sacred tenet of the RAF and Army Air Corps manuals. "Doctrine exists for a reason, Wade," his superior barked, pointing to the maps of the Mediterranean. "Pilots who lose their speed in a dogfight end up as burning wrecks in the sand." The tension in the tent was palpable. Wade stood his ground, not with the arrogance of a hotshot, but with the quiet, immovable conviction of a man who had seen the math work in the air. He tried to explain the energy exchange, the precise moment the P-40's heavy nose pivoted while the Messerschmitts' controls froze, but his words fell on deaf ears. To the establishment, Wade wasn't a pioneer, he was a dangerous freelancer whose luck was bound to run out, and he was sternly ordered to return to standard tactics before he infected the younger, greener pilots with his heresy. But the infection had already begun. While the officers dismissed him, the junior pilots, the boys who were tired of watching their friends vanish in the first 30 seconds of a bounce, began to gather around Wade's cot in the flickering light of the kerosene lamps. They saw the lack of bullet holes in his fuselage and the steady hand with which he held his coffee, and they wanted to know his secret. Quietly, and in direct defiance of his orders, Wade became an underground instructor. He used scraps of paper and empty ammunition crates to draw the geometry of the Wade turn, explaining the visceral feeling of the airframe shuddering on the edge of a stall. He didn't promise them glory, he promised them a second chance. The unexpected twist came during a high-stakes training sortie. Wade was shadowed by a senior flight instructor sent to evaluate his discipline. Instead of flying a standard pattern, Wade executed a mock break so violent and perfectly timed that the instructor, flying a superior aircraft, was forced into a humiliating overshoot that nearly resulted in a mid-air collision. The heretic hadn't just survived, he had turned the tables on his own superiors, proving that the manual was a cage and he had found the key to the lock. June 1943 arrived with a heat that shimmered off the desert floor like a liquid mirage, but the real fire was in the sky. A massive formation of 12 P-40 Warhawks was suddenly bounced by 20 German Messerschmitts, a lopsided engagement that, under the old doctrine, would have resulted in a slaughter. As the Luftwaffe dived from the sun, expecting the Americans to scatter in a desperate race for speed, they encountered a phenomenon that defied every German training manual. Instead of diving away, half the American squadron, those who had secretly studied Wade's energy bankruptcy theory, executed simultaneous high-G brakes. The sky became a chaotic theater of screeching metal and white vapor trails as the P-40s pulled into impossibly tight descending arcs. The German pilots, committed to their high-speed boom and zoom tactics, found themselves locked in their own velocity. Their controls grew stiff and their turning circles ballooned. One after another, the hunters overshot their targets, flashing past the American cockpits, only to find the second-rate Warhawks already pivoting behind them. The radio chatter, usually filled with panicked Allied calls, was now a disciplined exchange of vectors and timing. Wade, watching from the center of the fray, saw his mathematical heresy translate into cold, hard survival. The engagement lasted only 8 minutes, but it shattered the Luftwaffe's sense of invincibility in the theater. When the dust settled back at the airfield, the numbers told a story that High Command could no longer ignore. 3 P-40s had been lost, but 9 had returned safely, and 4 Messerschmitts had been confirmed destroyed.
In previous encounters of this scale, the loss rate would have been 50% or higher. This time, 75% of the squadron had survived. The twist came when an official flight instructor sent from headquarters to investigate reports of unauthorized maneuvers sat in on the after-action debriefing. He watched as pilots who should have been dead described how they deliberately stalled their aircraft to force an overshoot. Skeptical, the instructor demanded a flight demonstration. Wade took him up in a two-seat trainer and simulated the maneuver, subjecting the senior officer to the bone-crushing G-forces and the terrifying vibration of the dead zone. The instructor landed pale and trembling, finally understanding that Wade hadn't found a trick, but a fundamental mechanical exploit. The Wade turn was no longer a secret. It was becoming the new law of the Mediterranean sky.
By late 1943, Lance Wade had become a quiet legend across the Mediterranean, a wing commander with 13 confirmed kills and a reputation for bringing his men home. He had transitioned from the rugged P-40 to the faster Spitfire, and eventually the massive P-47 Thunderbolt, yet his machinist's soul remained unchanged. He was no longer just a pilot. He was a tactical architect, spending his few hours of rest teaching new arrivals how to survive the dead zone he had mapped out in the dust of Tunisia. Despite his fame, Wade remained an outsider to the high society circles of the officer corps, preferring the company of his mechanics and the cold, reliable logic of his flight instruments. He had survived hundreds of combat sorties, outthinking the finest aces the Luftwaffe could throw at him, and had seen his suicidal math become the gold standard for survival. However, the relentless pace of the war was beginning to take its toll. The man who never trusted instinct was now fighting a battle against physical exhaustion and the heavy psychological weight of every wingman who had ever relied on his calculations. He didn't seek medals or promotions. He sought an end to the unfair geometry of the war, working tirelessly to ensure that no American pilot would ever again enter a cockpit without the tools to rewrite their own fate. The cruel irony of Lance Wade's story reached its climax in January 1944 at an airfield near Naples, Italy. After surviving the most lethal dogfights in history through sheer mathematical precision, the demon of the abyss was brought down not by an enemy ace, but by a mundane mechanical failure. On a routine flight, the engine of his aircraft sputtered and died during the most critical moment of takeoff. For a man who had mastered the edge of a stall in combat, there was no room left to maneuver at such a low altitude. The aircraft slammed into the ground, and in a heartbeat, the tactical mind that had saved scores of Allied lives was silenced. There were no flaming tracers, no dramatic overshoots, and no final duel. Only the sudden, hollow silence of a stalled engine. His funeral was a somber, dusty affair held in a field near the front lines, attended by pilots who didn't just mourn a commander, but the man who had given them the key to the sky. Wade died at just 28 years old, leaving behind a legacy that was mostly unrecorded in official history books, but lived on in the muscle memory of every pilot who pulled into a high-G brake to save their life. The dust of the Mediterranean eventually settled, and the roar of the Allison engines faded into the silence of history. But the suicidal math of Lance Wade did not vanish with his passing. In the decades following World War II, as the world transitioned from propellers to supersonic jets, the fundamental principles Wade discovered, the deliberate management of energy and the weaponization of the dead zone, became the bedrock of modern aerial combat. The maneuver that once made squadron leaders turn pale was formalized by the U.S. Air Force in the 1950s and 60s as the high-G defensive brake. Aviation theorists and legendary tacticians, including those who developed the energy maneuverability theory, found that Wade's intuitive understanding of physics was decades ahead of its time. Computer models and advanced simulators eventually confirmed what the quiet Texan had proven with a pencil and a notebook, that a pilot's most powerful weapon isn't the speed of his aircraft, but his ability to control exactly how he loses it.
Today, the Wade turn lives on in the training manuals of top-tier fighter programs around the globe, stripped of its original name, but retaining the cold, calculated geometry that allows a pilot to turn a position of certain death into a lethal opportunity. Lance Wade's grave in a military cemetery in Italy remains a quiet, unassuming sight, far removed from the grand statues and public monuments dedicated to the war's most famous generals. There are no plaques detailing the 18% drop in P-40 loss rates or the scores of pilots who survived the North African campaign because of a secret shared in a dimly lit tent. Yet his legacy is written in the very physics of flight and the muscle memory of every aviator who trusts logic over fear when the tracers begin to fly. He proved that innovation doesn't always come from a laboratory or a high-command briefing. Sometimes it comes from the edge of a stall, born from the mind of a man who refused to accept that a second-rate machine was a death sentence. Wade's story remains a testament to the power of the individual, a reminder that in the most chaotic and violent environments known to man, a single person thinking clearly under pressure can reshape the geometry of war itself. He didn't just fly, he solved the sky, leaving behind a silent inheritance of survival that continues to echo through the clouds whenever a pilot pulls hard on the stick and watches their enemy flash helplessly past.